Yes. Hello, everyone. I'm Emily from Green Apple Books. Thank you all for coming to our event tonight with Oscar Villalon and Anne Raeff. Let me just say, first off, thank you for coming again after our technical difficulties last week. I do encourage you all to pick up Anne's new book. We have it on the front page of greenapplebooks.com. So if you just go to greenapplebooks.com, you'll see it right on the front page on the right, and I would encourage everyone to order it. But tonight we have Oscar Villalon. Oscar Villalon is the managing editor of ZYZZYVA. His writing has appeared most recently in Freeman's The Believer and The Millions. He lives in San Francisco. He will be talking to Anne Raeff about her new novel, Only the River. Anne's second novel, Winter Kept Us Warm, was published in February 2018 by Counterpoint Press. It won the silver medal for the California Book Award and was a finalist for the Simpson Literary Prize and the Northern California Book Award. Her short story collection, The Jungle Around Us, won the 2015 Flannery O'Connor Award for short fiction. The collection was also a finalist for the California Book Award and was on the San Francisco Chronicle's 100 Best Books of 2017 list. Her stories and essays have appeared in the New England Review, ZYZZYVA, and Guernica, among others. Thank you all, and please welcome Anne Raeff and Oscar Villalon.
Thank you, Emily.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for making the long trip out here. Hopefully, the trip was only from maybe the kitchen to the living room. Before we start in the conversation, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the book, just to kind of set the context for what's going to follow, but also just to see if, to do that, and then have Anne read a little bit before we begin. But first, I wanted to talk a little bit about the book, my impressions of it. I think it's a lyrical but unsentimental novel, traversing generations and wars. It's one of my favorite things to read, which is to say it's a US novel that understands the US as being part of the Americas, its culture and experiences meaningfully tied to the histories of the countries to our south. The characters are Pepa, that's how I pronounce it anyway, whom we know as an elderly woman near death in New York, but also as a teen girl finding her sense of self in El Castillo in Nicaragua, a town near the San Juan River near the border of Costa Rica, I think, if I have that right. She arrives there with Austrian parents, doctors fleeing the fascists in World War II. Her daughter and son, Liliana and William, find themselves drawn to Nicaragua many years later. William goes there to fight with the Sandinistas, and Liliana goes there to find out what became of her long missing brother. But we're also brought into the company and in the headspace, if you will, of people such as Guillermo, a young man who becomes close to the young Liliana, and Federica, a young woman who becomes close to William when he comes to Nicaragua. And there are many more characters, all of them fascinating, such as the two German men living in El Castillo during World War II, as well as people like El Justo, a Sandinista rebel living many years later in sumptuous comfort. All their stories connect, all their experiences inform each other, and of course, there's the natural world of this particular part of Nicaragua, which is a character in its own right. So I guess with that sort of introduction, Anne, would you mind reading a bit from your novel, Only the River?
I wouldn't mind at all, thank you. I just have to get a little bit used to this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read just a very little part at the end of the first chapter, just so you can kind of get a feel for what this town of El Castillo is on the river. And I'll read that first, and then I'm going to go and read another section, because the river and this little town are very, very important to the whole feel of the book. So in this first chapter, we learned that Liliana, who is Pepa's daughter, has left San Francisco. Her girlfriend of 20 years has left her for a man, and she's completely at loose ends. She drives to New York, back to her mother, where she grew up, and she arrives there. And so this is the end of sort of their first evening together. And Pepa tells her, tries to do this thing that they did when they were children, which was bring them to El Castillo that they don't know, to bring them back, and so that they can experience this place that was so important to her. So I'll begin. Knowledge is not the same thing as experience, Pepa said, as she always did when Liliana and William begged her to tell them about the river. Take us there. Take us to El Castillo, they would say, and Pepa would begin as she did now. Close your eyes, Pepa said, switching to Spanish. Can you hear the motor of the lancha? Liliana nodded. She could hear it now, the motor of the lancha getting closer and closer. Sometimes when she and William were lying on the floor in the living room, when the air was thick and still, and there wasn't even the memory of a breeze coming off the Hudson, she was able to feel a warm rain falling on her, and she would open her mouth to let the water flow in. What are you doing? William would ask. I'm drinking the rain, she would say. What does it taste like? It tastes like mangoes. What are you doing? I'm watching the monkeys. What are they doing? Laughing. Shh, their mother would say. If you talk too much, it will all disappear. Put your hand in the river. It's warm. Can you smell it? Pepa said now. Yes, Liliana nodded, as she had done many times before as a child. Listen to the motor and the lapping of the water against the lancha. There on the right bank are some herons sunning themselves. Now you are coming around the bend. Soon you will see the Spanish fortress on top of the hill. It's so big the houses of the village look like toys in comparison. Look at the houses, all those colors. Ours is pink, but you can't see it from the river. Can you hear the falls? The lancha is approaching the dock now. There is Don Solano's shop and there is the church. Don't take your hand out of the river, not until you're there, not until the lancha has pulled into the dock and the driver cuts the motor. Sleep, she said. You are safe now, Pippa whispered, as she did when they were children. Sleep. So that's the first part. Now I'm going to take you. So in the novel, there are basically two kind of parallel stories. I mean, there's a beginning story where both these families are together. Pepa and Guillermo are young lovers and they're together. And then their lives diverge completely. And Guillermo stays in El Castillo and Pepa moves with her family to New York. And so then there are these separate lives, these parallel lives. And so Liliana is the daughter of Pepa. And then this little section is about Guillermo's youngest daughter, Federica. And she has, at this point in the novel, she's just come back from fighting in the revolution. So William fought for the Sandinistas, not against them. I just wanted to make sure in case anybody worries about such things. And so she is also has just come back from fighting the revolution on the Sandinista side. And in the revolution, she meets a Russian pilot because, you know, the Soviet Union sent soldiers and trainers and people to Nicaragua. And so she learns to fly from him. And then she becomes part of a small group of Nicaraguans who are sent to the Soviet Union to learn how to basically work on factory equipment. So this is this part here. Before leaving for the Soviet Union, she finally went to visit them. That's her parents. But she did not write to let them know she was coming. On the way there, she imagined her mother jumping up from her stool behind the counter, running to the door to embrace her. She imagined her father dropping the box he was carrying. But when she arrived, he was out on a delivery and her mother did not rush to embrace her. Do you know what it's like to wake up every morning for 273 days, not knowing where your daughter is alive or dead, she said. I'm sorry, Federica said. I counted them, the days, her mother said. I didn't plan to stay away so long, but one thing led to another. I was fighting. It was impossible to send word. You could have found a way, her mother said. I'm here now, Federica said. But you will leave again, her mother said, going back to her bookkeeping. That night, she sat on the veranda with her father, listening to the sound of the falls and the insects. I'm going far away, she told him. He waited for her to continue, looking toward the jungle, as if he were waiting for someone to appear. They're sending people to the Soviet Union, she said. We will have factories here soon, and I will learn how to run them. What will the factories produce? All the things we need, like cars and planes and ships and refrigerators. You will see snow, he said. Yes, Federica said. I think it will be beautiful, he said. What if you never return? I will return, she said. They will need me here for the factories, she said. Will they build them here on the river? They will be everywhere, she said. Will that be a good thing? Yes, Federica said, but she was not sure at all. The snow was indeed beautiful. She had not imagined the silence, but that was the most beautiful part, especially since her life was filled with the churning of machinery, the constant clacking and clanking and clanging that stayed with her even when she was no longer in the factory. She hated the machines, the noise, the grease, the largeness of them, but she understood them better than the others did. She could lay her hand on a machine and know that it was too hot, or put her ear to its belly and feel that there was something wrong. They called her Dr. Federica. She lived with the other Nicaraguans in an apartment near the factory. They were always cold. At night, they huddled together, all 6 of them on the floor in front of the coal stove, covered with the 6 blankets they had been allotted, drinking vodka until they were able to sleep. In the mornings, when the coal had turned to ash, they could see their breaths. Sergei did not visit. When it snowed, they went out into the night and they ran through the snow. Those were the best times. In addition to technical training, they attended Russian and Marxism-Leninism classes. The classes were held right after they finished their work at the factory, when they were tired and hungry and cold, because they were always cold. The Marxism-Leninism teacher was a woman who had learned Spanish in Cuba, where she had been sent as a young woman to fight in the Cuban Revolution. She told them on the first day of the class, killed 31 capitalists. She asked them how many people they had killed, and the engineering students bowed their heads, for they had not killed anyone. 17, Federica said. A true hero of the revolution, the Marxism-Leninism teacher said, and Federica hated her after that. But the woman was always smiling at her, standing as close as she possibly could without touching her. She started inviting Federica to her apartment. I have Cuban records, she whispered. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Anne. Let me start by talking a little bit maybe about the background to the book, and we'll circle back to the book itself. You dedicate the novel to the world's 25.9 million refugees and counting. And we learn that your mother and your grandparents were themselves refugees who first landed in Panama and then Bolivia before immigrating to the United States. Could you talk about that part of your family's history?
Yes, so both my parents were refugees from the Holocaust and from World War II. On my mother's side, she was from Vienna originally, and they had an uncle who had moved to Panama during World War I to escape being conscripted into the army. So he was there doing some kind of business, and somehow they managed to get a visa to go to Panama. They waited there for, I think, 6 months. They tried to apply to come to the United States. They weren't accepted. They applied to other countries in South America, like Argentina, and nobody accepted them. The only country that took them in was Bolivia. So my grandfather was a doctor, and so he was hired by the Bolivian government to work. They were making a railroad connection from the farthest, the point where Bolivia and Brazil connect. So they were completing that railroad line. And so he was the doctor for the workers who were working on that railroad line. And my mother and my uncle and my grandmother stayed in this town called Trinidad that at the time was just like not even 1,000 people. Now it's kind of become a much bigger, almost small city. But they lived there while he was kind of off in the jungle with the railroad. And there was a lot of yellow fever there. That was one of the dangers. And so he was the doctor in charge of taking care of the workers there. And they stayed in Bolivia. Then they left Trinidad and eventually went to La Paz, which is the capital. And, that was more cosmopolitan. But my mother spent 4 years basically in this town of Trinidad. She didn't go to school. She just was there living, and it had made a big impression on her. She remembers her time there very, very fondly. And then just towards the end of the war, actually 1943, I believe it was, they managed to finally get visas to come to the United States, and they moved to New York.
Now, uh, so this is Bolivia, but you chose to, well, I shouldn't say you chose to set the novel. I mean, but this novel, this story takes place in Nicaragua. Did you originally think about doing it first in Bolivia?
I did actually. In my short story collection, The Jungle Around Us, there's sort of the germ story for this whole thing. It's called The Doctor's Daughter. That takes place in Bolivia because that's how I always imagined it. But when I decided to expand on that story and I just became this, I needed to have it set somewhere that I know well. I will go to Bolivia someday, but I haven't been there yet. And I spent quite a bit of time in Nicaragua. I first went there because I took students when I taught here at City Arts and Tech in San Francisco. The Spanish teachers and one of the history teachers, we took kids to Nicaragua, and so that's how I first got to know it. And I became just sort of, I loved it, and I just felt this connection. And then after, when I started thinking about writing this book, I went with my friend Suzanne Motley, who's here in the audience. We went and we did a special trip to go down to the river because I wanted to figure out. I was also really interested, the other germ is that I was interested at the time, I don't know if anybody remembers this, there was talk of building another canal that was going to go sort of just a little bit north of the San Juan River, right through some of the most pristine rainforests in all of Latin America, and through the indigenous reservation land, it's this big reserve, natural and cultural reserve. And there was talk of doing that. And so I was interested in that. I was worried about it. And so I thought we would go, I thought the book would be more about that, about the building of the canal and everything. And so we went down to the river and we just talked to people, all over, we traveled all over in Nicaragua, all the places that are in the book, like Galpa, and then we spent about a week going the river is amazing because there's no roads, you only can travel by boat.
Right.
By these lanchas and stuff. And so that's kind of the germ of the book. And then I, talked to people and I learned all sorts of things like, what their attitude about the canal was, which was basically that, it'll never happen because nothing ever happens in Nicaragua. What most people said. And then I saw, people who had been in Eastern Europe during the revolution, we talked about the revolution a lot with people, and that's where I kind of got this idea. And I met with this one guy who spent quite a couple years in Bulgaria, learning how to fix, big industrial equipment and stuff. And so that's where some of the ideas came from. So basically it was a kind of a trip where we just spent a lot of time talking to people.
The title, Only the River, I think it's somewhat ironic. There's in the book there's a lot of themes, not the least of which deal with politics that might be familiar to folks who've been following what's happened in Nicaragua in the past 10 years with the Daniel Ortega, and what's happened under his administration, sort of corruption and the people's losing faith, you could say, in sort of the values that he had originally championed. And you have all these sort of things too beyond that, the fight against the Contras, et cetera. But you also have, at the same time, and this is why I say the title is somewhat ironic, the fact of the presence of nature, of the San Juan River itself, of this nature preserve, as you were talking about, and how enduring this is. Something that comes to mind is something like the Red Badge of Courage, when you have these men slaughtering each other in the forest, and yet nature goes on and does what it's going to do. It's almost, if not indifferent, certainly not commenting on what's going on, and before it. I was wondering, could you talk a little bit about the San Juan River and what that place is like? You evoke it in the novel as this incredible, I mean, only incredible in the sense of pristine, yet maybe hostile isn't necessarily the right word, but definitely a place which you must traverse with some caution.
Yeah, I mean, so the San Juan River, for people who don't know, it's really quite interesting. This was the river, this is where people would, originally, like Mark Twain went on the San Juan River. That's the way you would get from the Pacific to the Atlantic. That's the way the gold rush people went on the San Juan River from the Atlantic to the Pacific side, and then up. So before there was the Panama Canal, and it used to be a much deeper river, and there you could actually have steamboats on it. So it used to be a place where there were steamboats, and the Spaniards, built this little. There's one part. It's full of. It's like there's a history of all of history is in this little river, and this town of Castillo. There's a falls, and the reason there's this Spanish fortress on top. Which is kind of, it seems like it's protecting, but to me, it's just this sort of looming thing about the history, about the conquest. It's just there, this memory of it. And yes, and so there was a time where that's where the Spaniards basically pushed the British back. And otherwise Nicaragua would be British if it hadn't been for this little spot in Castilla on the river. And so there was a time where this river was much mightier and deeper, and you could travel on it. And then because of the cultivation, along the banks and coffee plantations and all that, it was filled with silt and stuff. And so now really nature has taken over. It's more natural. Nature is stronger today now than it was in the 15th and in the 16th, 17th, 18th, even to the 19th century. So that to me is when you say that it's like nature's indifferent, it just kind of, there was a period where it was kind of pushed out, and then now it's back. So you definitely have this feeling that there's just little villages along the river that are there, and they're just kind of precarious, but the overwhelming feeling is that it's nature. It's just the animals and the noises, the insects and the birds. That's really a predominant feeling. You don't hear any cars because there are no cars. Even when you're on the river, these lanchas, they're just kind of like motorboats. They're quiet. They're pretty quiet. There's a hum of the motor, but it's just this very quiet kind of place where you feel. And there's another part, it's called Greytown. It was a settlement on the Atlantic side, on the Caribbean side. And it was the city that had this town that had like Victorian houses and all this stuff. It's just like, it's totally overgrown. It's just gone, because, yeah, so.
But you also, we evoke there's something divine to this place too. I think what I found also really appealing about the novel is that it is definitely set, I would say, within a sort of secular mindset. But that's not to say it is devoid of spirituality. We get this sense of the greater world, of the greater possibilities when we see these characters trying to spot a jaguar, trying to see what's in front of them that they can't otherwise see. Which seems to me sort of a beautiful metaphor for the way we try to live our life, that everything's right in front of us, yet we are unable to make sense of it. We're unable to see the beauty and the mystery right before our faces.
Yeah, I agree. And also because then we create conflict and, all of these things, and that keeps us even farther away from seeing what's right in front of us, what the truth is, and how to just be with each other, so that's part of it. It's like, that is part of it. So I think that there's that, that I don't know if I would call it, well, I guess it is spiritual on some level, but the mystery of these things that are just all around us, so that we don't really appreciate. Yeah.
So Peppa, I was really struck by her because she made me, basically, I guess, crystallize a thought that I guess was always there, but I never really, fully articulated, which is that of the concept of which you could call the twice over immigrant. And if you think about this, this would be so true for so many refugees, people who, especially when they're children, if they have to flee their home country, then there might be a transitional country that they have to stay in for some years. And then while they're at that place, wherever it might be, whether it be Nicaragua or say Germany, then they go to wherever their final destination is. And what I found really thought-provoking about Peppa is this idea that a person, especially if they're a child, could have their identity formed somewhere else and then come to their final home, as it be, and feel, I don't want to say quite twice removed, but just feel forlorn in the way that, say, someone else who also immigrated from that same country might feel upon arriving here. Would that be accurate?
I think that is accurate, and I think that I think that's because the reality is that, you know, refugees don't just go to one place, and that, and human beings and groups of people, you know, spend sometimes generations as outsiders in one land, and then they end up being kicked out, like look at the Armenians in Turkey, whatever, they're outsiders there, they live there for generations, and then they leave there. So there's different layers of removal from what their point of origin is. And I think that that's part of the Jewish experience too. You know, there's so many removals from the original place. You know, I mean, how much connection really is there for, certainly for secular Jews, to
Right.
the original place? But it's all these other points along the way. And growing up, I definitely felt, even though, you know, I had never been to Latin America, but I did feel there's a certain connection with this place that I'd never been to, and because my mother talked about it, and it was a place that saved my family. I wouldn't have existed without it. And my mother felt a strong connection to Bolivia and to the language and to the music and all these things. So it did become sort of part of, even through the next generation, which is one of the reasons I was so interested in you know, spending time in the Spanish-speaking world and learning Spanish. And, you know, it's become also sort of part of my something.
Did your mother, when you were a kid, did she speak to you in Spanish?
No, she didn't. It was very, I mean, we spoke German at home until we were about 12, and then everybody got very lazy about it. That was, my father and my mother had German in common. My father was Russian, my mother was Viennese, so they had German and English in common. They wanted us to speak another language, so we spoke German. And then the older we got, the more difficult it became for us to have, you know, complicated conversations, because my parents speak English very well. So, but we still, you know, that was kind of the original plan with my grandparents. We spoke German, and my mother's, the Spanish was kind of more on the side. That was kind of her thing. You know, she had her 78s, this Bolivian music that she put on sometimes. She was minored in Spanish when she was in college, and, you know, she had still connections with Spanish, but it was very much kind of something, her world, and she'd talk about it. And my grandmother too, I always liked stories. So when I go to my grandmother's house, so my mother always spoke about Bolivia. It was sort of very, you know, it was a romantic feeling for her. She loved living there. She was free, you know, she was very attracted, I think, also to Catholicism and things like that there. So she was really drawn into it. My grandmother, though, where I would go and talk to her, and she tell me the stories about, you know, the monkeys screeching at night, and it was so awful, and the mosquitoes and this and that. Here we were stuck in this little village because they came from Vienna, you know, and so she was not at all happy about being there. So I kind of got these two sides of it, you know.
You know, earlier we talked about the spiritual aspect of the jungle, of the wildlife, but, you know, this manifests itself again later in the novel, I think, through the use of the wonderful, the classic Garcia Lorca poem, Romance Sonambulo. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and how you use, how you deploy the poem throughout the novel. And for people, you know, if you're not familiar with it, that's the classic one that begins "Verde que te quiero verde," and then later the line, pero yo ya no soy yo, y mi casa es ya mi casa.
Yeah, that I mean, I love Lorca, I always have, and that poem for me is my favorite of all his poems. So it had to go in the book somehow. I had to fit it, but it fits perfectly, especially, you know, this idea, well, the green, you know, because the whole place is just so green. It's just, everything is green, and green kind of meaning life. And you know, that poem is sort of, you're looking at this dead girl, and, you know, that the poem is, and it's I want you green, I want you alive. And then this idea that now I am no longer who I am. I'm not, and I think that is the experience of people who have gone through upheaval and who have been uprooted. You know, they aren't who they are, but yet at the same time they are. I'm just interested in that, you know. Yeah, I think nobody is really who they are ever, because we're changing all the time. But I think refugees and immigrants feel that maybe even more strongly, right? That feeling of not having a home, and their house is not their house, and they find this whole new world, and then nothing makes sense anymore, because everything that you thought was the way it was, here this girl, she's 14, she's living in Vienna, she has her life, and then she comes here, and it's nothing at all within her experience, and she has to kind of relearn everything.
And this is true for so many of the characters in the novel too. And I think something I found really interesting about that is usually, if you think of it just purely in the U.S. context of something like this, if you say something like, I'm no longer who I am, and my home is no longer my home, it is, whether rightfully or not, tinged with a sort of optimism, like, oh, reinvention.
Mm-hmm.
But here, that's not really the case. This becomes a real crisis when you realize, well, if I'm not who I am, and if my home isn't my home, then who am I? Where is my home? And this could have incredibly dire consequences on a person.
And it also can be freeing, because maybe you don't have a home, and that's who you are. And I feel like maybe that's that whole feeling of, that sometimes being so rooted in a home. I mean, like Guillermo stays in his home. He's very rooted in El Castillo, but his children, Federica goes off to war, and that changes her, and her home is no longer her home, and she sees her home from above, literally flying, and then she has this trauma, and she goes out in the world, and so when she goes out in the world, and when she's killed, when she has participated in this, that is no longer her home the way it was before. And I think it worked, that's true, but so it's that stays with you, but then there's also a certain amount of freedom that maybe that you can look at the hopeful part about it is that if we could see the whole world as our home,
Yeah, and I think it invites us to consider the possibility of dwelling in sadness. That is just as a, if you will, a normal state, that there's tristesse there, right? There's also something that goes on in the novel too, this sort of discussion back and forth between various characters as to, what belief versus knowledge. And how it is that, some things that, like I believe at one point one of the characters says, well, I believe in death. I'm like, well, that's not something you believe in, it's a fact. You're going to die. So that's not something, that it make the most sense to say, I believe in. It's true whether you believe in it or not. But how that, I think, kind of speaks to this sort of idea that, I guess this goes back to the Lorca poem, that, we have to believe that things are always going to work out in the end. And that means that things are going to work out in a happy way. But I think, throughout this novel, you see examples of where that clearly is not the case, which isn't to say that these people, up until a certain moment of reckoning, aren't living fulfilling lives. It's just to say that it's not going to probably play out the way you think it is.
Yeah, though that's a very important thing. They have, so there's these young lovers, Pepa and Guillermo, when they're together, they can't imagine their lives without each other. And it's hard, it's horrible for both of them when they're separated. But then they do go on and have real and fulfilling, relationships and family, and that's just as meaningful, And it doesn't mean that makes their relationship or their hopes for what their relationship could have been less real or less meaningful. And so that's very important, because it's equally absurd it's just as absurd to think that there are happy endings as it is to think that they're only sad. They're sad endings, like everything it's up and down, it's just a cliche, but it's obvious. We can go through things, and there are parts in our life, and even though you suffer through a lot of sadness, that doesn't mean that ultimately your experiences don't bring you a certain sense of fulfillment,
I want to ask you one more question along those lines before I'll address people. Folks, if you want to ask a question of Anne, and you can type it into the chat, and I'll do my best to get to them. And I'll get to that as soon as I ask this one last question. which again also relates to the concept of belief over knowledge. Because there's also another example of this in the book that I found very funny, but also very pointed. At one point, I think Liliana remembers her mother telling her that the difference between people who live in El Castillo and Manhattan is that people in El Castillo know that the world outside their tiny patch of earth is enormous and full of things they do not understand or even know exist. But New Yorkers think that their tiny island contains within it all that there is to know. I mean, what does it mean to live with that sort of false certainty?
Well, that's one of the themes of the book too. That's sort of the hubris, and that's how come we're all in this mess. That's what the Western world has created. This idea that we know the world, and that I'm not saying our, but that, the European experiencer somehow encapsulates everything that is needed to know about the world, and nothing else is really valuable, and that's how we're in this mess. That myopia, that just only being able to see from within one's own culture is a huge problem. And understanding that there's all this stuff outside of that you don't understand is the first step to knowledge, really. I mean, so the lack of the small-mindedness and the lack of understanding of the world by people, the most so-called most educated people in the world has always fascinated me, really, because what is that? That just, and having grown up, in New York, and near New York first, in the suburb, and then in New York, this is what New York is all. I'm sorry to all my New York friends out there, but people in New York, there's this. I mean, I'm not saying everybody in New York, but there is that. That's kind of part of the culture of New York. It's like everything that is needed, the culmination of human, achievement can be found in New York, and that is just so far from the truth. Not that New York doesn't have a lot of amazing things and what I would argue that the things that are extraordinary about New York are not those things that, are considered extraordinary about New York, but in the, the little nooks and crannies that nobody ever goes to, and among the people, in places that are not considered New York, really,
Yeah.
So.
The Tenement Museum does it for me. I love that place.
Oh, I love that. I love that place also. I love that place. And I love New York. I love parts of New York. But the thing is, New York does contain all these things that people don't think of when they think of New York. And, people have these ideas about what places like El Castillo are like too, and they think that they know what that is, There's people that live in this town, just like we think we know about nature, about there's a lot of talk in there about, tourists coming in looking for animals, trying to find them. Like, we're going to find a sloth, we're going to find look for a jaguar.
Yeah, they hang out by the bus stop.
Excuse me?
They hang out by the bus stop. You just have to get there, before the bus
Yeah,
shows.
exactly. And all that's again, this idea of discovery, which is so much, kind of when we talk about the history of the Americas in general, this idea of the Americas being discovered, that, rather than the fact that it's always been there, just like nature, and people, it's not about a discovery. Nature's there, we don't really discover it, we maybe interact with it, and we should have a different attitude about it.
All right, let me get to some of these questions. First up I see is from Nancy. On the level of the sentence, how did you decide how to render two languages, characters speaking both English and Spanish, and maybe switching midstream in the dialogue? A lot of writers seem to translate, use italics, which never seems to work very well. Your way of doing it seemed natural and fluid. Did you try out different ways of doing it? Did you feel that some things just couldn't translate well? And how did you deal with it? This is an issue that writers often have to deal with. And I believe a lot of writers have tuned in to listen to you. Do you have any advice for writers who are dealing with double languages?
Gee, Nancy, you just came up with a really hard question. Thank you. Well, I don't know. I don't like books that are heavily into like using another language to convey what needs to be said. For me, when I, put in the Spanish that I put in the book, it's really to give, it's part of setting. It's to create a mood and to create this to kind of draw people, to kind of remind people about the setting and the sounds of the language. So I don't just like do these things like, he said, hola, he said, like stuff like that. That's not useful. You can just say hello. Like they're, English, I mean, they're both languages, English and Spanish, and you're conveying ideas. So obviously the book is written in English. So you have to be, I feel that one should be very, very careful when using Spanish or any other language when you're, another language besides the language that the book is written in. And I think what I do is if it's something that it's a certain feel or there's a certain expression or like using the poem, something that where there's a beauty to the actual phrase, that's worth kind of having in there for the rhythm. But not to have lots of, too much of it, because that detracts from the reader, not everybody knows Spanish. So I try to do it sparingly and make it very clear what it is that it means without translating it, and then mainly for the music of it, I think, and the flavor that's how.
Are there any plans to translate the book into Spanish?
I wish there were. So Misla is supposed to be working on that. Are you there, Misla? You can write and say, I don't know. I would love to have the book translated into Spanish. That would be a wonderful project. I think that.
Carol asks, is there one overriding theme in the book, or is there no single overriding theme?
Oh, there is not one overriding theme, I don't think. There are just a lot of different themes, but I mean, some of my themes that I always have in my work, which is sort of the effects of violence and war on individual lives and all that, that's in there. But, and the sort of shortcomings of political solutions. I'm interested in, failed revolution and why that fails. And, but then there's other, I wouldn't say that there, I don't know, Oscar, do you think there's an overriding thing? Or what would you say is that?
If there actually is, I don't know if it's overriding, but perhaps one that sort of all the themes coalesce around, it's actually something that Sarah Stone brings up in her question, which is that she says, Anne, I love the way you move through the different characters, the sense that we're traveling with the book, moving along the river. Mm-hmm. There is that sense in the book of things happen to you, the mm-hmm. swiftness of events, mm-hmm. of how you can't be carried, if not by forces larger than you, but just, I guess you could call the natural propulsiveness of life itself mm-hmm. can take you somewhere, even if you're not aware that you're being pushed in a certain direction.
I like that. I'm going to use that. I think that's true. And that's where the metaphor of the river comes in. The river just goes. I mean, it's just there. And just, it's not this fast being swept away. It's just this kind of movement. Yeah, always movement.
Another person asks, Anne, I often think of your characters as so gentle. They struggle, but there's little violence in your books, and I appreciate that. How intentional is that? Would you share with us a little bit about how and why you write about sadness without brutal violence?
Well, I think because I have not experienced brutal violence. I've been around people who have, but it's always been secondhand. I've had a pretty peaceful life, but I've been near a lot of violence, and we all have. I mean, it's all around us all the time. So I don't. And I also think that I'm interested in the sort of ripple effects of violence, the ripples of violence, and people who are not like right in the thick of things. War itself, the actions of war, or the, action that that's not something that I'm compelled to write about. But I do. This book does have some more. I mean, William is somebody I'm interested in. That people who have this violent nature, So William has this sort of inexplicable and uncontrollable kind of urge towards violence. He doesn't understand it himself. For him, it's like this, almost like a combination of savior. He wants to save people. He wants to protect people. He fights for people. He sticks up for people. I'm interested in that. I'm interested in people who, who stand up for causes. And so all of that is in there, but I think I don't, the actual sort of physical, violence it's not subtle enough somehow for what I'm interested in exploring.
Ron asks, or Ron says and asks, I love how many characters we follow in this novel and how we see their lives intertwined and also independent from each other. How/when in the writing did you embrace a larger cast of characters, and what draws you to writing multiple protagonists?
Oh my. I mean, I started out with Pepa and her family. And then I just put them in this town and in Castillo, and then they had to interact with other people. And I don't know. Because I think what story is with only one protagonist? I feel like, we might think of ourselves as the protagonists in our lives, but really there are all these other protagonists in our lives. I feel like, I'm just drawn to that connection between people, and in exploring what happens when those connections are broken too, and how they kind of move out from each other and back to each other. So I don't know. I like work. I don't like working with too many characters, but I found, I did kind of struggle because there were more children. I could only focus on so many people. Guillermo has a lot more children, but I just focused on Federica, right? I couldn't have all these other children. It's too much. So I did have to kind of pare that down, but
I guess that goes to
that's a question, but
I guess that goes to sort of follow-up questions. So from Tony, did you keep a master chart of your characters, especially in the early stages of writing this one, and perhaps not simply the characters, but also dates and places?
that's a very Tony-like question. I didn't. I do that. I should keep a master chart, but I don't. It's not until all these characters are there and I put all these dates, and then I have to go back and look. And sometimes I forget the names that I give to a character. I start calling them something else, and then I have to kind of, look around, make sure that their names are the same names. But then once I kind of have a big range of characters, then I do write them down. I have a notebook where I do write them down. But in the beginning, I don't. I'm not as organized as that. I just kind of get it all down there. And then figuring out the ages of everybody and the dates and all that, that kind of comes after. I get the story down, and then I just make sure that it kind of works historically.
Sue asks, what was it like on an emotional level to write a novel that had so many connections to your family roots?
Well, I feel like in a way, some people I always write about things that are very close to me. That's where I get my inspiration. And I grew up there were so many stories, and my family had such a, kind of just such a unusual and rich experiences. So that was always part of my life anyway, just hearing those stories and stuff. So it's not like I hadn't explored that before, not as a writer. So, and I do get emotional. Of course it's emotional, but I think writing is always emotional, no matter what you write about. You create a character that you don't really have any connection to in terms of your family. It doesn't even come from anything or anybody that really it resembles any experience that you've had, and you can feel very emotional about that character. So for me, I think writing is just always very emotional. Sometimes I find myself crying when I'm writing. I write a scene and I just, I don't even know, expect it. It's not, so that happens.
So a follow-up to that, how's your older family members that have experienced the Holocaust and immigration reacted to your novel?
Well, they haven't. My mother hasn't read it yet. I have to send it to her. There are not that many people left from that generation. My mother is 90. I hope she doesn't mind. I'll say that she's 93 years old. And she's really the only one from my family that's left that's had that kind of experience. And she was 12 when they left Vienna. From my first book that I wrote was much more specifically about the Holocaust. And there were some people from the older generation that felt that I didn't have the right to write about it, They kind of were upset about it. What do you know about it? But I feel like it's the next generation that has maybe the ability to do that, the distance and maybe the empathy to write about these things. Sometimes it's harder for people who actually experience it. So,
Christine wants to know, since publishing your first novel, if your writing process has changed now that you've published 3, That is, well, we know you don't. Well, you kind of do an outline. You do an outline, some sort, or did you used to outline but don't now?
I don't outline at all. I never outline. I don't know what I'm doing when I sit down, where things are going. I start with the setting, with some characters, with some, and then I put them there, and then they just start, things happen. And I don't know from one day to the next what's going to really happen. I mean,
Yep.
I go running and I think about like the next scene or what's happening, but
Yes.
I don't know where it's going, what the ending is going to be, or what all the, paths are going to be to get to where I'm going. I don't write like that at all. So
But you
there's
turn it
no,
over in your mind.
excuse me?
But you turn it over in your mind.
Oh yes, of course. I'm turning over my mind all the time, but it goes, sometimes it'll go one way, but then it doesn't end up that way, and it's very much a process that happens on it day by day, and I might think, okay, well, now I'm going to have to get this person to this place. And I think forward to the next chapter, the next event, the next scenes, but I don't outline things because I really don't know what a book is about until I'm writing. Well, like I only learn what it's about while I'm writing it, and I only learn what the characters are and who they are as I write about them. So
Sylvia wants to know more about William, the storyline of the brother who disappears. She's interested in how he came into the story.
yeah, how he came into the story. I'm trying to remember how that happened.
This is what happened in an outline.
Yeah, I don't know how he came into it. So, well, I had to get her to Nicaragua because I wanted there to be some kind of going back, for the next generation to get to Nicaragua. And I had to have a reason for that. And I had, at some point that came out, there was also, this idea. So the other part of the storyline is that Pepa's husband, her husband, Oscar, was a survivor of the Holocaust, and his entire family was killed in the camps. And that's whom she marries. And so William and Liliana are brought up in very much that milieu, that way, about the children that have died, that this is his second family. And I was interested, I was just interested in that, what it would be, like for this young man who, I'm interested in people who want to save the world, and he has this kind of this passion about justice, and it's, which, I can relate to, but he has it to this extreme where it's just doesn't even, it's not helpful. He destroys himself and others because of this anger that he has, this about the injustice and stuff. And I was interested in that. I'm interested in that, how to deal with that, how to manage that anger about injustice, and what happens when you can't manage it, and when it just becomes a purpose in itself, just this lashing out, the anger and stuff, and what that would be like to, and he sees his father as weak, as somebody who just gave himself up and his family up to being slaughtered, and he doesn't want to be that. So that's where William came in more for this idea that this sort of character, the type of character that I was interested in exploring.
I don't see any more questions, but I think I have one more for you.
Okay.
And I think, and this pertains to we were talking about before.
I think that, wait, 1 second. I think it's time for this is the cue for Laurie and Justice to come and walk on the gauntlet. Okay. Hopefully they hear me. Okay, go ahead.
And this speaks to what we were talking before about the idea of, people in El Castillo knowing that there's a giant world out there, but perhaps, cosmopolitan metropolis is not feeling the same way, or not knowing the same thing. And it has to do with, I guess you would call the queering of some of these stories. And it's really fascinating. That's to say, a lot of these characters we meet in El Castillo, their sense of life, their sense of the relationships that they have, well, I guess, well, just as I use that term, there's sort of there's a queerness to it.
There's a queerness. They're sitting on the opposite side. Nobody can see you.
No, we're waiting for you to answer.
Okay. Yeah, they're gonna
You know,
say hello really fast. Okay, okay, I'll answer. Okay, go ahead.
I don't want to get too much into it
The
because
queerness. Oh, there's a
it would be a
queer in your.
spoiler. Yeah, it would be a spoiler to sort of give away the sort of the queerness of some of these characters, and even in the sense of themselves identifying, but their experiences. And I was wondering if you could talk a little about that. Did that happen organically as you were telling their stories, or did you sort of have that already in your mind in terms of wanting to explore what that would look like in that setting?
Well, I think for me, because I am queer, that for me is just the way I see the world that way, and so it's not like, oh, I need to put a queer character here, or there's
Right,
this
right.
person there or that. It's just naturally, when I think of people, then some of them are going to be LGBTQ in some way or another. And so I just, and and I think that so in the past, and even to all the time, being sort of on the other side of that, the queerness helps you to see things that other people might not see, because you're the outsider and you can see things on the outside. But then also you're judged in a way that because of that. And that's where I put in the Germans. And so I always, I don't do it on purpose. I don't say, okay, no, I don't have enough queer people in this section, I better stick somebody in. It just happens, and some of the things come from my own experiences. And so,
And also, also too, in this setting, it's something very, I think, refreshing to see denizens of a world we might consider backwater be more sophisticated and more open-minded about the world than we might give them credit for.
Yeah, I think that, I have, spent quite a bit of time traveling and living in different kinds of places. And, I find that it's very interesting. People who are open-minded, I don't know what it makes some people more open-minded than others, but I find open-minded people among people who are highly educated and among people who are not educated at all, according to our sense of what education means. And then I find people who are very closed-minded who are highly educated, but also very closed-minded people who are not educated. So it's an interesting thing and I of course I gravitate toward people who are open-minded, and those should be the heroes. And you don't need to, there's something about some kind of inner core that makes people open-minded, I feel. Yeah. That I don't know where it comes from, but it's something to explore, I think.
But I think within the context of the novel, adds to the poignancy about, roads not taken perhaps, and life not going the way you thought it was going to go. Yeah. So it looks like it's our hour may be done.
Yes, I wanna. Yeah, we have to do some pretend that we're like in a place with other people. This is my family. This is Lori. This is Joseph.
This is a request. This is not our request. This is a request from a friend who said we had to walk by.
There they are.
Which seemed like it would be inappropriate.
I feel like we have to have some kind of human contact with this.
Yeah, we were actually sent down to the basement. She just locked the door and we came back up.
No, they went to we have an office downstairs. It's not a basement. It's not. So anyway, okay, now you guys are excused.
We're done. Bye, Oscar.
Bye.
So anyway, can I say a couple more things before we end?
Yeah.
So please, if you haven't bought it yet, please buy the book through Green Apple. That would be great. They will get it to you as soon as they possibly can. Everybody's working on getting things as quickly as possible. And the other thing is, I just want to thank everybody for being here and for listening to all of this. And let us remember maybe all of, not only the refugees of the world, but now everybody who has been affected by the pandemic, all the people who have lost loved ones, people who are sick, people who have lost their jobs, people whose lives have been turned upside down by this. So that's another big cataclysmic event in our history, that just like war and stuff. So we're on the river, all of us.
Mm-hmm. Right, and thank you again for this novel. It's lovely. It was a pleasure to read.
thank you, Oscar, for being so gracious and for your wonderful questions. And really, I really appreciate it.
You're most
Thank you,
welcome.
Green Apple Books. Thank you, everybody who has come to this. I wish I could go and give you guys hugs and sign books, and we could drink a toast, but we'll have to do that another time. Thank you
Indeed.
very much.
All right, everyone. I think we see ourselves out. That's what it looks like.
It's
I don't
time to go. We're just gonna click off.
I believe
Bye-bye.
so. I don't see Green Apple showing us the door.
Okay.
Folks, you're
All
just
right.
going to have to show yourself the door, and have a good night.